A man calling himself Mel Waters claims to have owned land with a bottomless pit, about 9 feet across and brick-lined for the first 15 feet. He tells Art Bell on the radio show that it descends endlessly into the darkness. It looked like a seal, but much smaller and with pale, soft skin and underdeveloped limbs. Its eyes were open and appeared to focus on the men, but they did not react like a typical animal's eyes under sudden exposure. There was no flinching or rapid movement. And the psychics who were tied to the Bulgarian military, who were working with the military on this project, they claimed that they were instructed to communicate with something beneath the shaft. He claimed that Hopi Indians had told him the same thing, that there was an underground realm, a hidden city somewhere beneath the desert where people could survive the cataclysm.
You have entered the 21st century dystopian portal. Welcome to confusion. Welcome to question. And welcome to clarity. The life is in the blood.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the 21 CD podcast. As always, it's your ghost, John. All my links are in the description. I've got a buy me a coffee there if you want to take me on a coffee date. I've got an Instagram, a Spotify, and some audio-only platforms if you guys can't watch video right now. And if you like this type of content, be sure to share it with your friends. Hit the little bell on YouTube and use up all your hype points to stay notified. And don't forget to like and follow. Also, the 5-star rating on Spotify helps me out a lot there too. Without further ado, let's get into it. Today we're going to be talking about holes. You guys have been requesting holes. As a matter of fact, there have been several people requesting holes. So we're going to be talking about some deep, deep holes today. And one of those deep holes is Mel's deep hole. Mel's hole can be interpreted a number of ways. And if I'm being honest, as with most holes, I really never gave Mel's hole any special attention until this episode. Many people see this hole as a sort of tall tale, and there's been shows made about it, stories written about it, all sorts of stuff. It's been a legend in my mind, fit for and made famous by Art Bell's legendary radio show, Coast to Coast. It's a story of a supposedly bottomless pit that led to the underworld, so I guess not totally bottomless. And it's rife with federal cover-ups and all sorts of stuff like that. And like I said before, I can't remember what the name of that show is, but that show is made about it. It has the guy from, man, I'm starting way too early. I've only had one cup of coffee, which means I'm really not in it. But Josh Brolin's in it. Somebody tagged the show that Josh Brolin's in about Mel's hole, because the show itself is actually not that bad. Well, I don't know. It's okay, but it's about Mel's hole, and all sorts of books and stories have been written about it, and it's been ridiculed by Redditors and speculative critics for years at this point. But because there's so much speculation surrounding this hole, I think we should start with the question. Assuming that this hole exists, or holes like it exist, whenever you go places called Devil's Hole or something like that, why is it called that? So assuming that there are actual holes out there, and this is one of them, is this the story of a real entrance to the inner earth? Is this what it would look like? Is this a story that is completely made up by a person with a great imagination? Or is there more to this story altogether? Do we have the desperate account of a man, Mel Waters, who found not one, but two entrances to the inner earth? A realm that he deeply believed and came to know is true, allegedly, because this is not his only hole. He has found another hole. The story of Mel's hole sits in that uneasy space, if you ask me, where tall tale and military secrecy and very old religious archetypes all kind of blur together. On the surface, it sounds like a classic piece of late-night radio weirdness, somewhere west of Ellensburg, Washington, near Manistash Ridge. A man calling himself Mel Waters claims to have owned land with a bottomless pit, about 9 feet across and brick-lined for the first 15 feet. He tells Art Bell on the radio show that it descends endlessly into the darkness. Locals, Bell says, had used it for generations as kind of an unofficial garbage dump. They just dumped their stuff they didn't want. They tossed in refrigerators, tires, and television, even livestock and pet carcasses, and no one ever heard anything hit the bottom. So they just assumed that it didn't really have a bottom, or they just didn't really care enough to investigate as long as they got rid of their unwanted trash. And native people supposedly knew about it before white settlers, as native people usually do, and some of those residents came to call it the Devil's Hole, assuming that it went straight down to hell. Mel Waters said that the first hole was on his land because, remember, he found two. So this first hole, this one that has come to be called Mel's Hole, he said it was on his land. And that curiosity eventually got the better of him, and he started doing some weird experiments on it. He was kind of worried about having an open shaft on his property and obsessed, you could say, with how deep it might go. So he rigged a crude depth test using fishing line and a heavy weight, as you do with all great big holes that you find. And he claimed that he fed line down and down and down and down and down, and he never encountered any resistance whatsoever. So the number he eventually gave Art Bell was pretty extreme. He said that it was about 80,000 feet of line, which is just over 15 miles. And he still never hit the bottom, allegedly. And geologists, of course, later pointed out that a shaft that deep in that kind of rock would be geologically impossible. The heat and pressure at those depths would cause the walls to deform and collapse long before you reached anything like that. And ordinary fishing line also would fail well before that length. But of course, they just don't want you to know what's inside the earth. We all know that. And inside the story itself, this quote-unquote no-bottom result was the pivot point. Because what began as a weird old well became, in his mind, a physical contradiction that the normal rules of geology couldn't easily handle. There were things that science just simply can't explain. Around the hole, he described a cluster of smaller, eerie details that made local people pretty uncomfortable. He said that dogs refused to approach the rim. He said that if he tried to drag any dogs toward the hole, that they would sort of dig their claws in and growl and stuff like that, but maybe they just didn't want to be thrown into the hole. Seems like pretty common sense there. He said that radios that would play normally a short distance away would start picking up interference or strange signals when they get brought closer to the edge of the hole. And most of this remains pure anecdote, but it matches the way rural legends grow around genuinely dangerous places. And of course, the area gets a nickname, in this case, Devil's Hole, and parents tell their kids to stay away because we don't know what's down there. One incident in particular hardened that reputation. Mel described a neighbor who disposed of his dead dog by throwing the body into the shaft, like everybody did with their dead animals, apparently. And later, that same neighbor supposedly saw what he believed was the same dog alive in the woods, wearing the same collar and tags, but behaving as if it didn't recognize him at all. Now, of course, there's no independent verification of this story. All of this information comes from Mel calling it in. Nevertheless, it quickly became the signature piece of lore that was attached to the hole, a kind of folkloric evidence that things put into the pit did not simply vanish, but were altered in some way and returned. And don't worry, it gets crazier. The native connection to the hole comes mostly through one figure named Gerald Osborne, who's better known as Red Elk, a self-described intertribal medicine man of native descent. And he told reporters that his father first showed him the hole back in 1961 and told him simply, "This is an endless hole." And Red Elk claimed to have visited it many times over the decades and said strange things always happened nearby. Odd phenomena, strange lights, your typical UFO type activity. And he went further than Mel by saying there was a small secret underground government base in the area connected to UFO activity, which wouldn't be surprising at all because it does appear that the U.S. Army is underground, or the U.S. military, I should say, not the Army. The U.S. military is underground pretty much all over the place. He also insisted that many people confuse Mel's Hole with another site that he called Devil's Hole. There's a lot of Devil's Holes. The devil has a lot of holes. And so it gets kind of confusing. But he was implying that even among those who believe, there is a tangle of locations and stories layered over the same sort of general landscape. It's important to be clear that there is no recorded Yakama or other plateau tribal legend on record that specifically describes a bottomless pit at Manistash. What we have are Red Elk's personal teachings and visions expressed through the language of native spirituality, laid on top of a modern story that only emerges in 97. The broader indigenous context of the ridge is quieter and much more grounded, but it does feed into why a feature like this would feel sort of charged. Manistash itself comes from a Sahaptin word, often glossed as "we are going root digging," which points straight at the traditional role of those ridges as first foods gathering grounds for plateau people like the Yakama and related Sahaptin speakers. And women dug up kamas and other roots there for thousands of years. They roasted them in earth pits and stored them as winter food. So root digging is pretty popular here. This is also, in Washington, so snow comes, the winter people are usually good foragers. So those root digging prairies were economically and spiritually important. And the earth itself was handled carefully, opened, burned, aerated, covered again, as you do. And in that cultural frame, the land around Manistash isn't just empty scrub, it is a place where the boundary between surface and subsurface is essentially routinely crossed and managed. And I'm not trying to make Mel's Hole sound like less than it is, but I will be the first to say that I do try to question everything, even the stuff that's weird. And I think it's entirely possible to make up a story about something that is real somewhere else, even if it's not real in your story. So everybody who listens to me routinely knows that I fully believe in the inner earth and that there are inner earth entrances and maybe even entire empires that are inside the earth that we just don't know about. And I'm not necessarily talking about just the military or just the elites. I'm also talking about there might actually be tribes of people down there who maybe do have different technology than we have, who maybe do have different abilities than we have, maybe are hybrids, maybe are lost feral tribes, who knows? What we definitely know for sure is that certain ancient people, did retreat inside the earth and start living there for various reasons at certain points in history. And this happened all over the world. We also know that Native Americans have many, many tales of beings that came out of the earth and essentially started eating them or even gave birth to their civilization there in North America. So we have these types of stories all over the world, and I'm not I'm not at all diminishing the idea that inner Earth entrances do exist. The bottomless part of it, I'm not exactly sure, because that would imply a portal, right? If it's bottomless, then it would just go all the way through the Earth. You could theoretically see through it. Obviously, you couldn't see through it, just like you can't always see through a really long tunnel. But if you fell into it, I'm not exactly sure what would happen if you fell into a bottomless pit. I don't know if you would burn up. I don't know if you would fall all the way through to the other side. I'm not exactly sure if maybe gravity, once you got to the center, would just destroy you. I'm not sure exactly what would happen, but I just want to make that clear before we get too far into this. I do believe in the concept that is being discussed. I'm having a hard time believing in this specific hole right now, but I mean, that doesn't mean it's not real. And so when we're talking about the locals in the area digging in the dirt for roots and stuff routinely every single year, to me, that's not really evidence of some kind of Native American lore leading to an inner Earth. That's just digging in the dirt for roots. But whatever the case, once Mel took his story to Art Bell's audience in 1997, the whole kind of stopped being just a local legend and it became more of a national one. His calls described this endless depth, the use as a dump, the dog that came back, the odd behavior of animals and equipment, and later the claim that federal agents stopped in and then they restricted access. And they effectively took control of the site. They just stopped by one day and they were like, okay, this is no longer Mel's hole. This is now the government's hole. And apparently they paid him millions of dollars to leave. And they even relocated him out of the country. So follow-up reporting by Washington journalists and the State Department of Natural Resources found no property records for anybody named Mel Waters in this county and no verifiable evidence of such a hole at all. One state geologist flatly called it geologically impossible and suggested an old mine shaft, perhaps. And so that kind of leaves the first hole exactly where it's always been. Not really in land deeds or survey maps, but in this overlap between a very real landscape with deep indigenous history, a modern caller with a kind of unverifiable identity, and a culture that is primed to believe there are still places on the map where the ground opens into something that doesn't quite obey the rules of science. And I believe in those kinds of places. But I also know that all those other things are true because I attempted to verify it myself. Now, if you go to this landscape and you try to look for Mel's hole, it is weird. And what I mean by that is you can't find it where Mel said it is. And if you try, you do see a bunch of restricted sites. You see satellite image that has clearly been modified. You see black rectangles over certain portions of the landscape. You see holes all over the place. If you really look for holes all over the place, there's holes everywhere. But it's hard to verify which one is actually Mel's, and some people have claimed to find it, but it's not still guarded by any government agency, which does lead you to wonder, is that the hole after all? Because if it truly was an endless hole, would it not still be controlled by the government? Or you would think that it would. Now, according to Mel Waters' own version of the events, the federal takeover starts almost immediately after he goes public about the hole. He got on Coast to Coast AM in 1997, and he said that shortly after the first broadcast, he returned to his property and found the area around the hole blocked by uniformed people. And they told him that there had been a plane crash in the vicinity, and that for safety and investigative reasons, he was no longer allowed to approach that part of his land. In other words, access to the hole was pretty much cut off under the pretext of an emergency aviation incident. The story then shifts from a simple restriction to something more like a sort of forced lease, if you will. Mel claimed that these men, whom he identified as federal agents, offered him a deal. They said the government would pay him a large monthly stipend in exchange for a perpetual lease on the land where the hole was. And different retellings of the story give different numbers, but several detailed summaries based on the Art Bell calls describe him receiving around $250K a month under this arrangement. And I would lease any hole for $250,000 a month. So, of course, Mel said sure, and he said that the payments began in March 97 and just weeks after his radio appearance. Then they continued until early 2000. And with that money, allegedly, Mel Waters relocated to Australia, specifically near Perth, where he set up a combination of a medicinal plant research project and a wait for it, wombat rescue operation. Because not only was Mel Waters passionate about the inner earth and holes to it, he also was very passionate about wombats. Now, according to him, the relocation was made suspiciously easy. He was told to leave town, wait at a rest stop, and then he was driven to an airport and flown to San Francisco, and then on to Australia, with the immigration paperwork already handled and even his dogs brought along. It sounds a lot like how I was whisked off to the army. Once I signed those papers, they were like, all right, bitch, here you go. And that detail has led some people to suggest that if the story was actually real, then there would have to be some level of coordination with Australian authorities as well, right? And maybe even a paper trail. But again, no paper trail was ever found, so this would mean also that the Australian government is somehow in on it, and who knows what strings the US government can pull. They can probably just tell anybody, like, hey, just don't have a paper trail on this, we'll give you $250K a month too, or something like that. And then, surprise, now you have, an illegal immigrant running a wombat operation in your backcountry. But there's a second act to the seizure narrative that takes place when Mel returns from said wombat operations in Australia. He said that in December 99, he returned to the United States to help a nephew move from Tacoma to Olympia. And he was also scheduled to do a follow-up appearance with Art Bell, which I guess he couldn't do from Australia. So on a bus trip during that visit, he claimed he witnessed an altercation between police and another passenger. Officers allegedly removed both the other passenger and Mel, for some reason, from the bus to take statements, maybe because he witnessed it. And from his perspective, there is a hard cut, because the next thing he remembers is walking in San Francisco 12 days later. His nephew had already moved without his help, so I guess he didn't really need him that bad anyway. And he had no real memory of how he even got there. And he said that he had been beaten. All his rear molars were missing, and he had a mark on his arm that looked like an IV insertion site. And all this led him to believe that he had been drugged and essentially held somewhere during the missing time before being dumped on the streets of San Francisco. So, when he tried to reestablish his life and relationship to the land after that episode, the story turns from a lucrative lease into something more like outright dispossession. Because Mel did do a follow-up on the Art Bell show, Coast to Coast, and he did this after he returned to Washington, which I guess he did. I don't know why he would do that if he was continuing to get paid. It was like he had this kind of drawing to Washington, and so he returned, and he went back to his property, and he was served with legal papers indicating that his ownership was now in question. He said the justification involved modifications made to the land while it was under lease, so presumably by the government, and that these changes were now being used to challenge his claim to the land entirely. In addition, he said that his financial assets had been frozen without clear explanation, and that his wombat facility in Australia had been dismantled during his absence, which at this point would have been 12 days or something like that. So at this stage in his account, he's no longer the man being paid $250,000 a month for a bizarre piece of real estate. He is this broke, legally entangled, and effectively cut off from the land kind of guy that started the whole saga in the first place. There's no money, there's no hole, and there's no wombats. All of this The plane crash pretext, the lease payments, the Australian exile, the missing time incident, the asset freeze, it comes entirely from Mel's side of the story, as told on Coast to Coast AM. And I'm not saying that the word of one man is not worthy of belief. I'm just saying that this story, it's not like when a whole town looks up and they see a massive UFO flying over their town. This is a guy who could be on crystal meth out here just talking on the phone. That's where this is coming from. There's no paper records. There's no lease agreements. There's no evidence of any wombat facilities or a hole, for that matter. But that's okay. Just because you're the only person to say something does not mean you are a liar. But it does complicate matters when nobody even knows anybody named Mel Waters. And from that perspective, the tale of federal agents taking his land is kind of part of a layered urban legend. It's a compelling narrative woven around this unverified person and an unverified hole, framed as a government cover-up, but never supported by the proper trail you'd expect from an actual eminent domain action or lease with six-figure monthly payments. And also land ownership spanning two completely different countries. But the legend doesn't stop here, because Mel found another hole. And this one was in Nevada. For some reason, his life bent toward the Nevada desert. And this is where I start to say stuff like, well, maybe Mel Waters wasn't who he actually was telling the entire world he was. Maybe this was a dude who actually was a real dude and was actually trying to shine a light through the fog, if you will, and tell people there are things out here we can't explain, and some of those things are entrances to the inner earth. And maybe this Mel Waters guy with this pseudonym was, quite literally, somebody who hunted for this kind of phenomena. And so whatever the case, you know, if you were talking about something that was definitely going to get you in trouble, you probably wouldn't use your first name on the radio. You would probably use a pseudonym. And if the government actually wants to cover something up, like, I don't know, the 500,000 missing children every year in the United States, then they can. They can just straight up cover it up, okay? Epstein, okay? They can definitely just cover up whatever they want. So it's not that far-fetched of an idea that there is a guy out here who's sticking his fingers in holes that he shouldn't be, and the government is covering it up. That's why I keep saying, like, just because I'm speaking in this tone, or just because I'm saying allegedly a lot, or whatever, it doesn't mean that what's actually happening isn't actually happening. It just means that the story as it's portrayed is questionable. But by the time that Mel's life sort of started again in the Nevada desert, the Manistee Ridge hole had already become a kind of curse word in his mind. He didn't want to think about that hole anymore, the original Mel's hole, because it wasn't even a part of his life anymore. At this point, it kind of ruined his life. He had been given this chance at something, and it had been taken away. He'd gone on air with Art Bell. He told the world about a bottomless pit in Washington. He watched the phones light up. He listened to 1,000 strangers breathe into the dark with him. And then came the fallout. Men in suits, pressure, everything that we've been talking about. So when he started digging into mystery holes elsewhere, and he did this allegedly through newspaper clippings and caller tips and old rumors from truckers and drunks and fringe researchers and other people on crystal meth, he wasn't really looking for a sequel. He was looking for proof that his life hadn't been completely swallowed by a single story. So instead, the pattern began to draw him deeper in. Hollow Earth legends, mine shafts that never quite got properly sealed, pits in war zones that people swore were older than the flags flying over them. And in the middle of all this mess, a single thread kept popping up. A strange shaft somewhere in Nevada, known to local Basque shepherds. And why does everything weird happen down here in this region? Well, maybe it has something to do with the Anasazi people. I don't know, but there's a lot of weird stuff that happens down in that region. And so the fact that he found, allegedly, another one of the devil's holes down there is not completely surprising. And the Basque people, for those who don't know, because I certainly didn't know who these Basque people were, but pretty strange. The Basque people are an indigenous European ethnic group, and they're indigenous to the Basque country, which is a region in the Western Pyrenees mountain that straddles the border of northeastern Spain and southwestern France. They're white people, and I guess they've been living in Nevada for a while now, and there's a population of about 1,000 of them. So I hadn't heard of these people before this story, but they are real. I was researching this, and I was like, who are these natives? I've never heard of these natives. It turns out like they're not really actually natives. They're white people who came over from Europe and still live in this kind of strange shepherding way. But they took him to this well, and he said it wasn't like any well that he had ever seen. And there was a metal circle rising up about 2 feet above the surface. It was a collared hole in the ground, if you will. And the collar was ringed with evenly spaced notches like gear teeth, essentially. And the throat of the thing opened in the middle of the circle, a perfect 9-foot aperture, just like the Washington hole, but it felt like something that had already been taken advantage of, something that had been installed instead of something that had been dug. And the Basque people treated it like a shrine that they wanted nothing to do with. Old men said they'd thrown junk in as boys and never heard the impact. There were rumors on certain nights the air around the collar went electrically still, as if the sky itself was responding to it in some way. And they really didn't want to get too close to it, but Mel didn't care. He walked right up to the collar, and he said he laid his hands on it. He said it was smooth, not like some welded farm scraps. He said the notches on it were clean. They were regular, like something meant to interlock with some type of machinery that was no longer in place. And it reminded him less of a well and more of some kind of industrial interface, the top of a machine buried beneath the earth. It made his Washington hole feel kind of primitive by comparison. And regardless, he brought in the same tools that he used last time. So he brought in some line, he brought in some weights, some improvised instruments to measure depths, and these Basque shepherds just watched him as he did all this, allegedly. And listen, again, if you are a hole searcher, if you search for holes, if there's a certain type of thing that you familiarize yourself with searching for, it's not surprising that Mel found another hole. I mean, just go on YouTube. You've got ghost hunters and cryptid hunters and Nephilim hunters. You've got all these people who are constantly hunting for whatever they specialize in hunting for. And some of the time, allegedly, they believe they're actually finding these things. So it's not surprising that another hole was found, especially if you already believe in the inner earth, as I do. But again, we have just Mel's account from this story. And so anyway, the story goes that he started chucking stuff in there. That's really how he started. Nothing happened. He couldn't hear the bottom. And everything just kept falling. There was no sound response coming back. He said the collar didn't ring like normal steel when he tapped it. The sound died very quickly, as if the metal were sort of absorbing it. And allegedly, there were a lot of stories about things happening, strange things happening to items and beings that are lowered into the shaft. I don't know how many people experimented with this, but Mel said that there were stories of things being lowered into the shaft and stuff happening to them. And so for some reason, the Basque people were all on board with this, and they kind of helped him build a crate, a crude harness, a winch, and they chose a sheep. They gave him a sheep, and they were like, here you go, lower this. And now all of a sudden, they're willing to help him on this mission. For some reason. I don't know. The longer I researched this story, the more it kind of fell apart for me. But they lowered the sheep into the hole, and they just kept lowering it, and gradually the sheep stopped making any sound. And the men continued to monitor the marked rope as it unspooled, and eventually they got to several hundred feet, and then over 1,000 feet. And by the time they passed roughly 1,500 feet, they had not encountered any bottom or any change in tension that would indicate contact with the surface. So they chose to stop at this point, not because of any obstruction or anything, but because the depth already exceeded normal expectations for any kind of water well or ranch shaft. And then they reversed the winch and they brought the crate back up. And when the cage reached the surface and the sheep with it, they opened it up and the sheep was completely unresponsive. It appeared dead. But what stood out immediately was the discrepancy between the time elapsed, which I guess was minutes, and the apparent condition of the body. The wool was intact, there were no burns, no scorched areas, no smoke or unusual odors, but the carcass itself it looked as if it had been for a much longer time. And on handling, the body exhibited a notable change in tissue consistency. The flesh felt dense, it felt cooked rather than fresh, not rigid like you'd get from rigor mortis, but which probably wouldn't have set in that fast anyway, but uniformly softened as if exposed to heat from the inside out. And there was no visible external injuries, no bleeding with a D, and no evidence of trauma at all. There was no obvious signs of chemical burns or external radiation type damage, none of that. But then one of the guys noticed an abnormal swelling on the animal's side, and the swelling was firm and clearly not present before the descent into the pit. And it gradually formed a discrete bulge beneath the wool and skin, and it was smooth and tense to the touch, and the group decided to cut it open. So using a knife, they opened the swollen area, and inside they found a cyst-like structure containing a small organism. And the organism was surrounded by this fluid and attached internally by a cord of tissue that resembled some kind of umbilical connection. And it was described as kind of seal-like in overall body outline, like it looked like a seal, but much smaller and with pale, soft skin and underdeveloped limbs. Its eyes were open and appeared to focus on the men, but they did not react like a typical animal's eyes under sudden exposure. There was no flinching or rapid movement, only this sort of steady observation. And several of the men, allegedly, later described a strong subjective experience at this moment, the sense that an organism was aware of them and was projecting an emotional state, specifically pity or sorrow. And there were no vocalizations, no measurable form of communication, none of that. Nobody reported hearing words internally or externally. It was simply an experience as an intense, non-verbal impression. And this element of the story is inherently anecdotal and can't be verified at all, but it's kind of consistent in all of the retellings of the events. But like I said before, if this is a story that's told 1,000 times and the details are all crazy, this is obviously going to be one of the crazier of details that's going to be repeated, because you basically lowered a host into a bottomless pit and out comes an alien sort of creature living within this host. I've pretty much seen this on Alien, as a matter of fact. Isn't this how the xenomorph is born? But Either way, the organism did not attempt to attack or escape, they said. And after being removed from the cyst, it moved on its own power toward the edge of the shaft. Its movements were weak, albeit directed. The men did not physically restrain it. Why would you? Probably because they were afraid, they were disgusted, they were uncertain of it. So they just allowed it to continue into the hole, and then it reached the rim, it went over the edge, and then just dropped into the shaft. And I guess they said the tissue cord also trailed behind it until it too just vanished into the depths. So that's pretty weird. Later, when recounting this sequence publicly, Mel added a personal medical detail to the story. He's just got all sorts of crazy details that just pop up out of nowhere. And prior to the Nevada incident, he had been diagnosed, I guess, with advanced throat cancer, some kind of esophagus cancer with a poor prognosis. And you know, we hear about this stuff. There used to be a time when throat cancer was extremely popular, and that might have been because smoking was not as frowned upon as it is now. But it was, you know, there was a conspiracy theory, and there probably still is. It was also circulating in the MK Ultra circles and stuff like that, where people would literally just be dying of throat cancer. One day you don't have it, and the next day you do. And whether or not it was the Clintons or not is up for debate, but that was an actual thing. That is an actual conspiracy theory. And so maybe he did get it when he was kidnapped for those 12 days or whatever. Maybe this is something that developed within him. Or maybe it's just another element of the story. But after returning from the site and following this whole episode with the alien and stuff like that and the sheep, subsequent medical imaging reportedly showed no trace of his cancer. So no new treatment had been initiated between the terminal diagnosis and this moment when he went and got a second opinion or a checkup. But now he was all of a sudden healed. And in his version of the events, the only notable occurrence between those two medical assessments was his time at the shaft and his encounter with whatever was inside of the sheep. So, if you or somebody you love has throat cancer, cancer of the esophagus, you know what to do. There was another story. Some said that the hole occasionally emitted a black beam, like a column of darkness that lanced upward into the sky, not necessarily blocking light so much as canceling it out altogether, like a negative photo kind of burns straight onto the air. Others swore that experiments with ice lowered into the shaft produced something impossible, ice that burned without melting, a kind of dry flame that heated rooms but left nothing but brittle husks instead of actual water. And the Basques wanted no part of these things. And the longer that Mel stayed, the more they grew uneasy until eventually they were just kind of like, okay, we're done messing with it. And that was kind of the end of the story. It's just so much. There's just so much going on. It's an engineered rim in the desert atop a bottomless shaft, and then it overlays that with sacrificial livestock and otherworldly fetus thing, this miraculous healing and impossible physics. It reads kind of like a fever dream, if you ask me, stitched together from a kind of folk Catholicism, some kind of UFO lore. And if you're looking for any contradictions, you will find them the longer you look. I'm not here to disgrace the story necessarily. I'm just here to look at it from what I consider a realistic perspective. And there's a lot going on in this story that doesn't really, I don't know. It's just very hard to believe. But again, I'm not saying that just because it's one person's story, it must be a lie. There's a lot of people can say that my experiences are lies, and people do. People think I'm on crack all the time. So it's not like I'm saying that this story isn't true. I'm just saying I wish there was more to it. I wish that Mel had brought anybody with him. If he's got all of these people who are throwing their garbage into his holes, all of these people who are experiencing certain things, like, wouldn't even one of them just get on the show with him? If you were Mel, wouldn't you be like, hey, this is going to be a really hard story to tell. People are not going to believe this. This is the second hole I've found. Will you come on to the show with me and just verify this and just like back me up? Even if Mel had no friends who actually witnessed it, even just paying somebody to get on the show with him would have made it a little bit better. And then he could have just been like, hey, just be like, yeah, dude, every time I say something or something like that. I don't know. There are just certain things to consider, you know, and I hate resorting to science when it comes to some of these things, but we do know certain things about the Earth. It's not like everything that we've ever been told is a lie. Unless you're a flat earther, and then everything you've ever been told is a lie according to your theology. But this story violates nearly every constraint of geology and just basic physics. So, like, when researchers went looking for a real person behind the name Mel Waters, again, there's nothing. There's no property and tax records showing any owner by that name in the area where he placed his land at either time. Local journalists could not identify any person with that name. So we already know that Mel Waters is a pseudonym. We already know that it's breaking the laws of even basic science that is hard to not believe in. No hole has ever been found. And there have been plenty of amateur expeditions, and there's no shortage of it. It's just go online and Google this stuff. You'll see all sorts of people looking for it. Lots of suspicious pits, lots of deep caves, lots of weird holes in the ground, but none that appear to match these stories in a verifiable way. The depth claim alone is kind of enough to break the story. Of course, that's the way a cover-up works. You know, there's not going to be thousands of these holes that are easy to find, so it's easy to cover up one or two. But the deepest confirmed human-made hole on Earth is the Kola super deep borehole, and that's that one in Russia that they say that you can hear hell through, and only goes about 40,000 feet into the ground. It's about 7.5 miles before the combination of heat and rock forced the drilling to stop. And even at those depths, you're looking at, you know, rock that is starting to flow plastically under pressure. And science says that there's no realistic way to have a 15-mile deep air-filled shaft through the crust in these locations that's stable enough for somebody to casually lower fishing line or livestock into. And again, I don't believe everything that science says, but I do believe a couple things science says. And I do kind of feel like I agree with that. The mere depth of the hole that he allegedly verified is suspicious in of itself. That being said, in this time period, there were holes popping up all over the place, and I will give Mel that. You know, like, sure, you can say, well, he was just developing his own whole story because there were all sorts of other whole stories going on at this time, and he wanted to get his little slice of the pie. And there is that, but there could have also been like sort of this global cover-up of these entrances that were actually going into the earth. So like, you do have that hole that Russia abruptly stopped digging. You do have a couple of Mel's holes. You do have some other holes that are going on. And one of the craziest one is the Tsarichina excavation, which began as a military project that was framed as a treasure hunt, but nothing about this operation behaved like any search for gold or treasure. And this took place in Bulgaria. Armed guards had essentially sealed off a Bulgarian village for 2 years, and soldiers dug a descending corkscrew-shaped shaft that really made no engineering sense. This actually happened. It really made no engineering sense for retrieving artifacts at all. And the Ministry of Defense, not historians, who you would expect to be searching for treasure, ran the site. And weird enough, The weirdest detail of it all, if you ask me, is they brought in psychics and they poured enormous resources into a hole that was barely 2 feet wide. And the secrecy was so absolute that when the dig abruptly ended in 1992, the military didn't even archive it. Again, another thing that just kind of was meant to disappear into oblivion. Instead, they concreted the entire shaft shut. They classified the reports, and they pretended that the entire project had been just this misguided rumor, even though there were very many witnesses and very many people who came forward being like, no, this is actually real. And a movie actually came out last year about it in Bulgaria. And a lot of people were kind of like, okay, if this was such a mundane project where you were looking for treasure and it didn't happen, then why are you all of a sudden classifying everything and making it super weird? And why did you bring in psychics and all this stuff? But what slipped out later didn't help the official narrative either. Soldiers who worked the site were reporting equipment failures, their lights were dying, their compasses were spinning, their radios were cutting off the deeper they went, a lot of stuff that was going on around Mel's holes. Several described the kind of uneasy feeling of being observed while they were underground in the hole, and not really in a superstitious way, but the same kind of physiological tension that precedes panic in caves or deep sea dives or in the woods at night. Like you feel like something's watching you. The hair on the back of your neck stands up. None of them had felt this before on their other government projects, so now all of a sudden they were getting this weird vibe from this specific dig. And the engineers claimed that their tools hit this smooth, impenetrable barrier that was very far below the surface. Something that was definitely artificial, but not metallic. It was like a polished stone or a fused glass kind of material. And the psychics who were tied to the Bulgarian military, who were working with the military on this project, they claimed that they were instructed to communicate with something beneath the shaft. And Baba Vanga, whose involvement is documented, it's not a rumor, she's like this mega psychic who is extremely accurate in her predictions, reportedly warned them that what lay below was not human and also not dormant. So whether or not those statements were metaphor or not, the ministry behaved as though they had found something they could not categorize and they could not control. And when the project was canceled, the response was not scientific analysis or public explanation, but a total erasure of the whole thing. So that's when they filled all the shafts with rocks and concrete, and the official paperwork disappeared. The government basically said there were no results, nothing to see here, even though the entire behavior of the operation itself contradicted that. And in the years since, the site has become a sort of gravitational point for theories. Everything from extraterrestrial relics to ancient chambers to interdimensional barriers, some kind of failed attempt at contact with something that's older than the world, maybe. But what keeps the story alive is not really this glittering speculation, but the shape of the cover-up, the way that they covered stuff up. Because normal projects end with conclusions, right? Like look at like Oak Island or something like that. Look at even CERN. I mean, CERN is like heavily publicized. We don't really know what's going on there, but we know enough to know that weird stuff is going on there. And even the government is kind of like, oh yeah, we're trying to open a portal. But in this case, they were just like, no, nothing happened. Nothing's happening. Nothing will ever happen. And so from that perspective, Mel's story looks less like a sort of unique whistleblower account and more like one in a group of whistleblower accounts. And that kind of, in my opinion, could lend him a little bit of credit, or it could lose him some credit, depending on your perspective. But if there was a sort of global movement to cover up these entrances to the deep inner Earth regions at this time, then sure, maybe Mel's Hole is one of the examples of that being shown. And I also don't think that we should gloss over necessarily the fact that where Mel's original hole was found is is adjacent to the Yakima Training Center, which is a vast U.S. Army live fire and maneuver range that covers like 300,000 some acres across central Washington. And that complex does include the Manistash and Saddle Mountain Ridges, and it has hosted a research and interception facility, which is often linked in discussion to the Echelon-style global signals and intelligence network. So there has been stuff going around in the area of these holes with the military and with the government as well. This is not just a place where hunters and ranchers roam. It's literally a landscape that's dotted and crisscrossed with restricted areas, test ranges, classified infrastructure, and in general, just deep engineered structures that the public probably has never heard of or rarely ever hears about. And then you can add to that the story of Hanford, which is one of the most contaminated nuclear sites in the United States, and that's roughly 60 some miles away from Mel's Hole, where highly radioactive waste is just entombed in the earth and kind of allegedly monitored in a cleanup program, which is scheduled to last for literal centuries. We are literally just putting all of our most toxic stuff inside the earth at any given point. There's nowhere else to put it. It's not like we can just, send it to space. So where do you think all that stuff goes? It goes deep inside the earth. We're poisoning our own planet in that way. And central Washington is, in a very literal sense, a place where dangerous things have been buried and where you're strongly discouraged from a bureaucratic, from a legal, and even from a practical standpoint from digging too deeply. Because you might find yourself a nuclear waste program or something like that. So that is also a real possibility. But before we wrap this thing up, because we're getting kind of long, I've never talked so much about holes for so long. But there's another crazy hole that not many people talk about, and that's Manson's hole. Well, Manson's Devil's Hole. And this is Charles Manson. And on paper, this Devil's Hole is just a detached unit of Death Valley National Park. It's this fenced-off slit in pale limestone with a turquoise pool at the bottom and a handful of endangered pupfish that are just barely clinging to existence in this chamber whose full depth nobody has ever seen. A geologist will tell you that it's a karst window into essentially a vast carbonate aquifer. It's a flooded fracture, if you will, that plunges at least 500 feet into the rock with side caverns that disappear into nothingness. And the USGS divers have gone deep and they've clocked it with instruments, and they still have to admit that no, we actually don't know how deep it is. We don't know how far it goes. And from, when they say something like that, you might as well just say that, yeah, it's infinite, it's bottomless. But this is the setting that Charles Manson wandered into when his helter-skelter fantasies drove him out of Los Angeles and into the desert. A lot of people don't really know this about Manson, but by 1968 or 69, Manson had basically fused together this private end times cosmology, and he lifted imagery from the book of Revelation. He considered things like the angel opening the bottomless pit and unleashing locusts and destruction, and he treated it not really as just something symbolic, but as a literal description of geography. He said there would be a race war, civilization would tear itself apart, and while the world burned, he and his followers would not just hide in some random cave, but they would actually descend into an underground city accessed through a very specific hole in the earth, an actual bottomless pit, somewhere, he said, in the Death Valley region. And to give this more weight than just some drug-addled Bible reading, he claimed that Hopi Indians had told him the same thing, that there was an underground realm, a hidden city somewhere beneath the desert where people could survive the cataclysm. That syncretic bridge is entirely his, and researchers who've studied his theology are blunt about it. He mashed the Christian abyss together with a vague, kind of distorted understanding of Hopi underworld lore to basically justify his own survival bunker fantasy for the end of the world. But even so, this idea is pretty revealing because in his mind, the bottomless pit was both biblical and indigenous, both prophecy and local secret. It was not some just mere abstract hole out there. It was a missing piece of the map that he wanted to find. He intended to find this hole into the earth. So when the family decamped to the desert, Spawn Ranch, Barker Ranch, rundown mining camps and abandoned prospector cabins, etc., Manson became obsessed with locating this pit, this entrance to the underworld. Accounts from his former followers and later park and press write-ups all hit on the same detail. He literally spent days wandering Death Valley and the Amargosa Desert looking for any mysterious opening that would lead to water and shelter underground. Now, this is a landscape that is filled with burned rock and flash flood washes, and so he was looking for one that was different from the rest, and he figured that maybe it would be protected by a government fence, and well, yeah, that's exactly what Devil's Hole is. Because he didn't trust the government either, and there's all this kind of talk about how Manson was a CIA operative, or Manson was an MK Ultra facility. He was a tool of the MK Ultra program. He had deep ties to the government, believe it or not, and that story is insane in of itself. But yes, Manson did work very closely with the U.S. government as part of a secret program, which is not talked about enough, but should be used to definitely question the government. But anyway, back to the hole. After he found this place, he reportedly sat there for hours cross-legged near the fence and just stared into the pool. And he was convinced that beneath that glowing water was the literal entryway to the underground city promised by both Revelation and what he said the Hopi people had told him. And to the Rangers, he was just one more hippie, one more unstable drifter in a national park. But to his followers, he was a prophet sitting at the mouth of the abyss waiting for it to open. And to the government, he was an asset they had invested thousands, if not millions of dollars into. So that site now, as you can imagine, is heavily governed. Devil's Hole is fenced, alarmed. It's under constant federal watch. And it's not really because of a cult, but they say to protect the pupfish that live there, allegedly, and basically the hydrology from vandals and groundwater pumping, and trespassers have been prosecuted, divers have died trying to explore it. The official story is very simple. It's dangerous, it's sensitive, and it's scientifically important. But if you are inclined more towards suspicion, it almost appears too perfect of a protection, right? So, coincidentally, this is the same region, more or less, as Mel's second hole in Nevada. There's a wider backdrop here that makes the whole thing feel a little less accidental. That being said, Devil's Hole sits not very far in desert terms from the Nevada test site, which is the old proving grounds for U.S. nuclear detonations, and from Yucca Mountain, the famously controversial proposed nuclear waste repository. So once again, you get this evidence that the government is also dumping stuff underground. The region is literally Swiss cheesed with all sorts of underground workings, instrumented shafts and tunnels dug for atomic tests and storage and research over the decades, mine shafts from the gold rush period, all that kind of stuff. The same basin and range country that gives you natural karst fissures also hosts man-made caverns. There's all sorts of blast debris and test devices and long-term radioactive device just pounded into the ground and left there for our generations to come to deal with. And I don't want to undermine all of the ancient accounts of holes to the inner earth and tunnels to the nether realm that their ancestors came out of, that monsters came out of, that Nephilim came out of, that all of these beings came out of. I'm not saying that those things didn't happen or that I don't believe in those things. But what I am saying is that the desert around Death Valley is filled with holes. And some of them are mapped and labeled, and some of them are not. Some of them are fenced, some are hidden in plain sight with nothing more than a sign that says danger, keep out. And some of them are probably undiscovered. And some of them might just actually be the entrance to an inner Earth region. Something, a civilization down there that we don't know about. Relics, discoveries of massive archaeological importance. Things that they don't want us to see because, as we always say on this show, they are things that would rewrite the narrative, and we just can't have that happening, guys. We can't have the entire world coming across a narrative that changes the whole perspective of mankind to the point where they want to overthrow the powers that be. They want to start believing in something other than science. They want to start believing in a real God on a massive scale, which would cause them to understand that government is corrupt and has been here to hide the truth the entire time. And so now we're not going to obey. We're not going to comply. We're not going to pay taxes. And everybody who is in power is going to be out of power. So I don't see this all as just some generic inner Earth obsession from crazy people. I think that it goes deeper, and it comes down to, if we can't escape outwards because we will be found, humanity will always attempt to escape inwards. Thanks for watching. The life is in the blood.